A few months ago I put out a free Max for Live device called Borrasca Sidechainer. Since then I've also published version 2, which is also free. Both of these are available on my Gumroad and have recently been updated to versions 1.4 and 2.1. Here's all three devices. The first two come with version 1 and this is version 2. Initially when I came up with ARM sidechaining, it had to be done with Melda plugins and a bunch of routing. Since then there's been implementations in other DAWs and with other plugins, but the problem with it was that it was complicated to set up and that plain ARM sidechaining sounded distorted, which meant you still had to combine it with conventional ducking. The idea behind Borrasca Sidechainer is an audio or MIDI triggered as of version 2 device with accurate triggering and lookahead, a useful oscilloscope, and to include RM sidechaining. The whole reason I even started learning Max 6 months ago was just to make this. I've worked 2 jobs for months, which is part of the reason I haven't uploaded anything here for a year. During the summer I took my laptop to work every day and was learning Max while making these devices during breaks. I also ended up making a couple other devices, but I think I'm finally done with developing now that I've made everything I needed. I'll start with version 1. It's audio triggered, has 10 milliseconds of lookahead, and has a pre-fade and ARM sidechaining. So when you first load it, you would pick your drums from here, and then it gives you the envelope generator by default. So you can adjust the pre-fade and the hold and decay. And I made the oscilloscope rectified and flipped upside down so you can match the ducking curve to the waveform easily. Then you can blend this into the envelope follower, which is color coded green. It has a lot of smoothing, which makes it longer than the drum itself in most cases. If you want to make it shorter, like horizontally, you can do that with the envelope length. And you can also adjust the pre-gain of the envelope follower to make it not as deep. One problem with the envelope follower is that because of the smoothing, it doesn't react quite on time with the transient. It lets some of it through, as you can see here. You can add the transient detected pre-fade to the envelope follower with the pre-fade button. So now you get the envelope follower but with the pre-fade. And if you adjust the pre-gain, it might not reach the bottom. But then if you enable the pre-fade button for the envelope follower, it'll reach down to the bottom and then crossfade into the rest of the envelope follower. And then you can even add hold to it. Then there's ARM sidechaining, which is color-coded red. And as you'll notice, the ducking curve itself becomes identical with the waveform, which has been rectified and flipped over. So this would be plain ARM sidechaining, and what you can do to alter it is you can smooth it out. This will add some attack and release. You have the ARM envelope and length knobs here, which will adjust the length of ARM sidechaining, so you can focus it on either the transient or sustain. If you decrease the ARM envelope knob below 0, it'll focus on the transient, and you can adjust the length of the transient with the RM length knob. If this is at 0, it's unaffected, and then when you raise it up above 0, it'll focus on the sustain. There's also a pre-gain for the arm sidechaining, which will make the effect stronger. Using all of these controls, you can shape the arm sidechaining to almost resemble normal ducking if you want to. What I suggest doing if you're using arm sidechaining is to combine it with either the generator or follower. And something you could do is just add a very short ducking envelope. So it'll do a clean volume envelope for the transient. And then when you enable arm sidechaining, it'll take care of the rest of the signal. And the more ducking envelope you include, the less you'll hear distortion from the arm sidechaining. So if I make this longer and then enable arm sidechaining, it'll just affect this area here. There's also a gate mode which will flip this from ducking into gating. Then there's a sidechain input button, so if you disable it, it'll just listen to whatever is on the track that the device is on. These two knobs are useful if you put this on drums, because that way you can volume shape the drums themselves. I would disable the sidechain input, enable the gate, and then you can just re-envelope the drum. And you can get a cool distorted effect on it if you enable arm sidechaining with the gate mode. The other device that comes with version 1 is the XL device, and it's literally the same thing but doubled inside one instance. So you have two inputs, which I've named kick and snare, and you also have oscilloscopes for them. The workflow with this would be to first start with the kick and pick the kick input, and then just adjust the settings until you're happy with them. You can hide the kick oscilloscope, enable the snare one, and then pick the snare input from here. And now you can just do your independent settings for the snare. There's also these visual blinks next to the inputs to indicate when triggering is happening. The reason I made this XL device separately is because usually you'll want to have different settings for the kick and snare, and normally you would just duplicate this device and do it separately. But the problem with this is that this device has a fixed latency of about 10 milliseconds. It's 441 samples. If you duplicate it, you'll get the duplicate amount of latency as well. But with the XL device, you can get the maximum amount of pre-fade, which is 10 milliseconds, on both the kick and snare, but still keep the latency at 10 milliseconds because it's in one device. Then there's version 2, which is what I prefer. I made it later, and the reason I made it is because I want to replace all the knobs with these MSCGs. This also has MIDI triggering, and the latency will be the same amount as the pre-fade. So if you have no pre-fade at all, this device will be zero latency. And how this works is you select the drum source, then you set the length of the MSCG with this slider here. This will affect both the oscilloscope and the actual length of the curve that's drawn in. And then just draw in the ducking shape you want. You can initialize this shape into an upward saw, but you can also move these points so there's nothing in the edges. In that case, it'll assume that there's like a point here and a point here, but you don't actually need them. So you can just delete these. And you can even delete the second point and only have one, in which case it'll also just assume that it's just one horizontal line. Now that there's no pre-fade or latency, it means that the envelope will start sample accurately, which will generate a click, which you will want to avoid. And you can see from here that this is what we are getting. As soon as it detects the transient, it'll go down within one sample. And this is the transient detection alone without any latency. And you can see it starts within 2 samples. So it's very quick. I worked a long time on this transient detection algorithm. But there's also MIDI triggering. I've set up these MIDI notes already, and you can just pick it from here. If you have the MIDI in button enabled, it will ignore the transients and just listen to MIDI. So if you have no input at all, but the MIDI button is enabled, then you're not getting any ducking. But as soon as it gets MIDI notes, it'll trigger. And as you can see, the actual onset of the kick sample is here, where the MIDI note is, and my transient detection is only a fraction of a millisecond later. Also, if the envelopes are triggered by the transients, you will get a green blink here, but if it's from the MIDI, it'll be yellow. So as soon as you start increasing the pre-fade, the latency will go up with it. So if I do 5 milliseconds, the latency is now 5 milliseconds. And it gives you a 5 millisecond pre-fade before the transient. I find this better than in version 1, where it's always just 10 milliseconds. But in version 1, it was the envelope follower algorithm that needed that latency as well, and version 2 doesn't have the envelope follower at all, so I could make this just be 0 latency if I want to. The envelope depth knob is a bit different from version 1 as well. This will give you the maximum gain reduction, so if you wanted to go down exactly -6 dB, you can just type it in here. Same goes for the RM sidechaining. You can decide how many decibels of gain reduction RM sidechaining will give you as well. There's 2 MSCGs here. The blue one is just the volume curve, and the red one is for the amount of RM sidechaining. This replaces these knobs from the first device, these ones. So by default, the RM sidechain envelope is at the minimum, but if you adjust it like this, you can just decide where the RM sidechaining is focused on. And even with this, an easy way to control the amount is to delete one point, and then this just becomes the depth amount. The RM smoothing and pre-gain from version 1 are here as well. But with the MSCG, you can now be much more accurate. You can also do gating with the envelopes themselves, which is why there's no gate button here. If the last point of the envelope is below halfway point, the oscilloscope will flip because it'll assume that you're gating, and whatever the value is at the last point, it'll sustain there until it's triggered again. So if I do this shape, it's now just gating. You can see it from here as well. The way the pre-fade works is it will fade from the last point of the MSCG to the first point within this amount of time. So if I put in 10 milliseconds, it'll go from this point to this point, as you can see here. If I put the last point here, it'll scale according to that. And this will also work even if the points are not exactly on the edges. This is just the amount of arm sidechaining. So if you want to do gated arm sidechaining, you would have to enable the arm gate mode from here. This curve here will also determine the maximum gain reduction. You can copy and paste these curves to each other. And another new thing is a tempo sync length option here. If you're doing MIDI triggering, then this sidechain input will determine what's being fed into the oscilloscope. So if you have this on no input, but you have MIDI triggering on, you'll still get the ducking, but you won't see anything here. If you want to see the waveform, you have to select the audio track from here. Now it's not being triggered by the transients at all. It's just being triggered by the MIDI. This also applies to arm sidechaining. If you don't have anything selected from here, then obviously arm sidechaining won't do anything because it's not getting any audio. So you can get a MIDI triggered volume envelope while also getting arm sidechaining. To add points, you would just click anywhere, and to delete them, it's shift click. To adjust the curve between points, you alt drag. But this is very sensitive, so I recommend doing alt shift drag. In my previous video about sidechaining that I uploaded a year and a half ago, I claimed that lookahead is unnecessary with sidechaining, which is wrong, and I'll prove it here. So here's sidechaining without any lookahead. And it looks like that. Here it is with lookahead. There's a slight difference to the transient without lookahead. The worst case scenario is if you have like a sub bass at full amplitude and then you get full on sidechaining without lookahead. You'll get that short single sample click with the transient and it'll be audible. That's what this is basically simulating. You can see it from here that if I sum these together, the transient will look like that. But if you have pre-fade, transient is actually clean and doesn't have any extra peaks right before it. Yeah. So I recommend always using lookahead in whichever plugin you're using. All of these have lookahead, so these are good options. I don't like the one in duck because it doesn't have any value to it, so you'll just have to guess what the proper amount is. I already went through this in my previous video, and the same goes for chain shaper. It has a click smoothing button and a smooth click slider separately for some reason, and there's no unit of value for this. It's just 20 something. So I'm not a huge fan of the lookahead on these plugins. GM Audio Ducker does a pre-fade very well. It's fixed at 512 samples, and it's a very simple and nice plugin. Provided inspiration for me when I started making Sidechainer. Shaperbox is also a very good plugin. It has more latency. Just the audio triggering alone will cost you 14 milliseconds. And then if you want a 6 millisecond pre-fade, it'll cost you 6 more. If you do audio triggering with this, it'll be 20 milliseconds right off the bat. And then if you duplicate it for different settings for the kick and snare, you get 40 milliseconds. So that's why I still prefer my device to any plugin out there. But there has been a dedicated ARM sidechain plugin released within the last 6 months, I guess. This is made by a Russian developer, and it's just simple ARM sidechain with a release knob. So that will help smooth the distortion out. If you want to do ARM sidechaining, just plain simple, then I recommend this VST. It's free, and I've linked it in the description. So you don't have to do any of the Milda plugin routing shit again. That's about it for Sidechainer. My other Axo device that I made is called LFO5. It's basically the Vital or Serum LFOs made available into Ableton. I'll make a separate video about this sometime, but you can map this to anything. Yeah, cool. So yeah, see you next time.